In the fall of 1980, Yamaha unveiled its all-new motorcycle lineup for the 81 season at its annual dealer meeting. A really awesome little mini dirt bike called the Yazinger? Anyways, that was a little bike meant to revolutionize the under 10 riding market. Oh, and a liquid-cooled motocross bike. I mean, everything was really exciting and fresh. The dealers were thrilled. And then this thing rolled out. Needless to say, the Yamaha dealers weren't exactly thrilled. It's not that a cruiser in Yamaha's lineup was really all that out of place at this point. Yamaha had taken their stagnant twin platform, the XS650, and turned it into the 650 Special, which was basically a cruiser in disguise, and that bike was really a hit for Yamaha, and it was the Special lineup that would influence this new motorcycle. Little did those disappointed dealers know, this odd new motorcycle would be the first of a new kind of motorcycle, a truly purpose-built Japanese cruiser meant to take on Harley at its own game. It might seem a bit simplistic to define eras of motorcycle history by decades, but it does seem as though major, defining, and often lasting shifts have happened right at, the turning point of specific decades. Take, for example, bikes like the 59 Bonneville, marking a trend for 60s motorcycle styling and performance, the 1969 CB750 and its formula that really impacted the entire 70s, and in this case, the 1981 Yamaha Virago, beginning a trend for Japanese motorcycle companies building purpose-built cruisers through the 1980s and the 1990s. Despite the fact that they dominated the entire motorcycle market through the 1970s, a concept was beginning to emerge that would bring about change among Japanese manufacturers. And the concept was UJM, the Universal Japanese Motorcycle. So influential was the CB750 that Japanese motorcycles were becoming known as, well, essentially all the same. Now Honda fans in the crowd will say, yeah, known for being good, and they're not wrong. But you can't fault people for seeing it this way. If you look at any particular lineup from pretty much any Japanese company in, say, 1975, well, you can't blame someone for seeing the similarities. And so, as the 70s came to a close, some of the Japanese manufacturers started experimenting with entirely different kinds of motorcycles. Now, I've made an entire video on the history and really the rise and fall in popularity of Japanese cruisers, and in that video, I mentioned making a separate video on the Yamaha Virago, the motorcycle that really started it all in many ways, and apparently many of you wanted that video. Who knew so many of you plus 50 Americans were into Japanese cruisers from the 80s and 90s. At the end of the 70s, some of the Japanese manufacturers made a few somewhat lazy attempts to disguise their high-revving sport bikes as American-ish cruisers. Also, in general, many of the flagship models from companies like Triumph and Norton were just beginning to look more, well, also cruiserish. For whatever reason, after all that work in the 60s to outperform Harley at every level, the Japanese companies kind of just started wanting to make Harleys. Now, most of these attempts hadn't really taken off for any of the companies, but Yamaha was really onto something in the late 70s. With the help of many cruiser variants in their lineup, in twin and even four-cylinder variants, Yamaha had a leg up on the competition. But to this point, no Japanese manufacturer had actually built a cruiser from the ground up. That is, until the Yamaha Virago. Now, it started as Project 003 at the beginning of 1978, the stated goal to be the undisputed leader of Japanese cruisers in the United States. Now, Yamaha was killing it at this point, especially with their lazier attempts at cruisers. They were right on par with Honda for total motorcycle sales, and they were really growing rapidly. So this was their moment, their opportunity to leave Honda in the dust by essentially creating a new kind of motorcycle. Honda sales at this point were kind of stagnating a bit. They hadn't really made very many new motorcycles, towards the end of the 70s. They did make the Honda CBX, but even with all the work and effort that went into that bike, it was still just, a furthering of the Japanese and, UJM concept of bigger, faster, high-revving bikes, and it was pretty much a failure. Now, back at Yamaha headquarters, the team tasked with designing an all-new Japanese cruiser, well, they were disagreeing on the very identity of the bike, which is not good. This wasn't arguments about, how the side covers should be designed. No, this was the entire motorcycle. What the heck was this bike even supposed to be? On the one hand, the engineers wanted the Virago to be packed with all of the latest tech, things like monoshock suspension, and essentially they wanted the Virago to be a sort of high-tech power cruiser or hot rod. The engineers were primarily concerned with their motorcycle being considered a Harley copy. Now the other camp, that is the US division of Yamaha, they wanted a thoroughly American motorcycle, one that wasn't really focused on performance and tech, but rather the characteristics of a classic V-twin cruiser, things like feel and character and style. Oh, and there was a third camp, and this is my favorite group, because they were just so helpful. That third camp just wanted to make the Virago not a cruiser at all, which is really helpful. Now, the biggest problem with the Virago from the outset was that no single camp really won in the end. Both groups made concessions, and so the Virago, labeled the XV750, was both a traditional American-styled cruiser, but also it featured sport bike elements clearly visible, like the lack of, again, twin shock rear suspension. Sure, it was a V-twin, and it did look like a cruiser, but everything was just a bit off. Technically speaking, the Virago sits as the 5th ever Japanese-made motorcycle to feature a V-twin. Now, you might be wondering what precedes it. Well, Harley built a Japanese licensed V-twin all the way back in 1929. Then we have Rikuo, I'm not sure how to say that. Essentially Japanese Harleys. Then the Marusho V-twins, and then of course Honda's CX500, and finally the Virago. Now the uninformed called the Virago a Sportster copycat, but it was so much more. And as we'll see, it probably wasn't enough of a copycat. In terms of the engine, this 75-degree, not 45-degree, 748cc overhead cam V-twin did something very interesting in terms of the layout. Up to this point, manufacturers had not figured out how to make both sides of the V in the V-twin identical and interchangeable. When you think about this, all other V-twins weren't identical twins, they're more like fraternal twins. Sure, they are mirror images, you could say, but they're not the same barrel and head. But if you look closely at the Virago engine, it appears to be a mirror as well, but actually the heads are turned 180 degrees from each other, with the intake on the inside of the V for both and the exhaust on the outside, and individual cam drive towers for both sitting on the right side of the front cylinder and the left side of the rear cylinder. But again, the barrels and heads are identical. The engine itself is incredibly compact for what it is, but Yamaha traded weight savings for this compactness. I mean, the engine almost weighs as much as a Honda 754. For this market, though, a bit of extra weight wouldn't really be a problem. The engine was mounted to the pressed steel frame as a stressed member for lower center of gravity, with the rear swing arm and shock. In many ways, the Virago, as an advanced piece of motorcycle engineering within the V-twin category, well, its heritage is less American and more British, a sort of evolution of the high-performance V-twin Vincent Black Shadow. That monoshock suspension wasn't exactly a new thing in the motorcycle world at this point, but on a bike like this, it was really forward-thinking. The biggest advantage, of course, is adjustability with a total of 20 different settings for the shock, not only making it a bike for all people, but also various types of riding. Now that name Virago, what's in a name? Motorcycle names are interesting. Throughout various eras and periods, motorcycle manufacturers have used various methods to name their motorcycles. Pretty much 2 methods, I guess. You can either focus on a bunch of letters and numbers for your bike, or you can give it an actual name. I've always been a fan of the latter. Don't call your motorcycle the XJ450 CR2. Call it the Jackknife or something. Honda CBR 1000 RR SP1. Or just Honda Fireblade. It's just, Honda has the best name with Fireblade. It's the best motorcycle name ever, and they don't even use it half the time. The Virago was officially designated the XV750, but the name Virago was also everywhere. A Virago is, according to the dictionary, a violent, domineering, or bad-tempered woman, which sounds to me quite a bit more like a Ducati than a Yamaha. Now, why this name was chosen, I guess we'll never know, but it certainly didn't describe the bike in any way. Fireblade, Black Shadow, Mach 3, Eliminator, these names have more direct meaning. The Virago's styling bordered on custom, it had an upright stance, Sportster-esque, one could say, but not quite Sportster. The kids would say that it was like a Wish.com version of a Sportster. A slim, small gas tank for a 750 for this time, but still about 1.5 gallons more than the current Sportster 1000. Harley has always understood the importance of style over function when it comes to gas tank design. The lines of the Virago were, very flowing, but where they flowed, that is down to that low rear, it doesn't feel right. That coupled with the old school sort of Flanders handlebars that curve down, the exhaust just didn't make sense on this kind of motorcycle. It was all just a bit odd, to say the least, and you could kind of tell, looking at the first gen Virago, that, there were multiple competing ideas kind of coming together in one motorcycle. And because of that, it really didn't know what its identity was. The bike was no hot rod in terms of performance, just sort of right in the middle for a 750 twin. It weighed about 500 pounds, made about 55 horsepower. It did the standing quarter mile in 13.2 seconds, had solid fuel consumption. Essentially, it revved less than Japanese 754s, and sure, less power and revs does mean less speed, but better miles per gallon. Comparison to other Japanese 750s is kind of pointless because that's not what this bike was meant to be, and Cycle World realized this in their early testing of the Virago. The Virago isn't a Japanese 750, it's a V-twin cruiser, and should be compared to other bikes in that class, where the focus is more on character and feel and rideability and style and comfort. The Virago was smoother and way quieter than Harley's bikes at this point. But Cycle World notes at the time that the Virago kind of fails to do the one thing it sets out to do, which is cruise. Hard on the throttle, it was great, but for just sort of bumbling around and taking it easy, which, let's face it, that's where cruisers are supposed to really shine, this first generation Virago just wasn't really doing its job. Upon its release in '81, the bike didn't hit the market the way that Yamaha intended. The first few years of the 1980s were also hit by a recession. A new bike that is, targeted at the US market had really no chance of hitting massive sales numbers at this time. But there's no denying that riders also just weren't that interested. Ed Burke, who was head of product planning over at US Yamaha, was one of the most vocal when the Virago was originally thought up, and he wanted the bike to be more holistically suited to the American cruiser market. And finally, after 18 months of low sales numbers, Yamaha Japan started listening to his opinions. A UK-based custom bike pro named John Reed had recently won a few first-place prizes for his Virago-based custom motorcycle. So Burke teamed up with him to build basically a prototype to show to the boys over in Japan. The goal was to make a cruiser that actually appealed to American riders. It was to take the Virago power plant, but strip it back and make it what it should have been from the very beginning. And this is where the Virago would really start to find its form. The power plant and shaft drive did stay, but pretty much everything else was changed at this point. For this new generation of the Virago, lower handlebars coupled with a more raked out front end helped the proportions massively. A sleeker, more teardropped fuel tank swooping down to a plush, thick, comfortable looking at least, seat that flows into the classic, twin shock rear and the Harley-esque twin exhaust. I mean, there's simply no denying the 83 Virago with its wonderful chrome and gold bits is absolutely leaps and bounds more appealing than the original Virago. Interestingly enough, none of these changes really hurt the performance of the machine either. Despite the ongoing effects of the recession and the new tariff placed on large displacement imported bikes for the US, the Virago was finally a hit with American riders, and a cult classic was born. For 1984, the Virago now came in 700, 750, and 1000, and later 1100 forms, but also in this sort of new style, the Virago would appear in the 1980s all the way down in 250cc form even. It became kind of an entire model line for Yamaha, and a really successful one at a time when not very many manufacturers, even the Japanese manufacturers, had very many hits. The 80s was not a great time to be making new motorcycles. Cycle World's test of the 84 1000 Virago is fascinating. They note the bike is sitting in a parking lot at one point, and a bystander walks up and just says, "Well, they finally got it right." Now, there's no way to know exactly what that man meant by his remark, but for me, I think it's much deeper than just, Yamaha's rework of this motorcycle. It's more than just Yamaha getting the Virago right. See, this bike, and especially this redesigned version of it, wasn't the first Japanese cruiser. We have to remember that. It was just the first entirely purpose-built cruiser made specifically for that market. But again, not the first Japanese cruiser. There had been quite a few before, and the American market was very much aware that the Japanese were kind of trying to make Harleys. But this bike, in this new form, truly was the first Japanese cruiser that did pretty much everything right and actually nailed the styling. And that's what I think that bystander meant. I think he meant that finally a Japanese company was figuring out how to make an American-styled motorcycle. This quote from that Cycle World test sums up Yamaha's success in bringing on the American cruiser segment. They say, and for more graphic proof, they should ride the Virago, then park it, well, just about anywhere. Within minutes, people will be oogling the bike, asking questions, praising the styling, and more often than not, finishing their comments with, "Sure looks like a Harley." That last statement is delivered not with contempt, but rather matter-of-factly, almost as if the statement were synonymous with, "Sure looks nice." The Honda CB750 brought performance and touring capability and just big bike vibes to the masses by giving it incredible reliability and usability. But the CB750, because it's so different, never really displaced the American cruiser market the way that it did, for example, the high-performance British market. It took those bikes down, but it never took down something like the Sportster. Harley just kept chugging along through the 1970s. And sure, they would also survive the Japanese cruiser onslaught. It's not like the Virago was going to bring down the Sportster, or really any of the bigger Harleys that it would compete with, but the Virago did bring that reliability and that Japanese efficiency and quality and ease of use to the American cruiser market. Now, I noted the problems with early Viragos in terms of cruising. They just didn't rumble along like Harleys. But later on down the road, Yamaha would start to figure this out, especially in the larger displacement models. Despite massive amounts of chrome and gold accents on anything that's round, and I'm not kidding, it seems like it's everything that's round, it's actually the engine that shone brightest for the Virago 1000. Increases primarily in stroke brought up that low-end torque, making the bigger Viragos perfect for low-speed around-town use. As I'm sure all of you know, the fun of a cruiser is that low-end torque, and that's what this bike had. And by the mid-80s, Yamaha had just figured this out. But perhaps the single biggest factor for riders who would consider a Virago at that point, or maybe, a Honda Rebel or a Yamaha Bolt today, is affordability. Through most of its life, it cost a bit less than Honda's Shadow equivalent and significantly less than a Harley equivalent. But the Virago was never a premium motorcycle. It was never meant to be that. It was just a cool, reliable, simple, sporty cruiser built to make you feel like you were getting quite a bit for your money. Through its 15-year run, the Virago would be a massive success and help carry Yamaha into its future. Not just of making cruisers, as we all know the Virago is the predecessor to bikes like the V-Star and the Roadstar, and also the Bolt, but the Honda Shadow and so many other cruisers would take notes from the Virago's early DNA. This bike was also a lesson for Yamaha and manufacturers worldwide to listen to their local divisions in designing bikes specifically for those markets. The Virago in its original and unsuccessful form didn't really need to exist. They could have skipped that first bit of failure if they had just listened to the American division. And no doubt this is true for also, American and British companies who say want to make a motorcycle specifically designed for Eastern markets. But also, beyond Yamaha and cruisers, I think the Virago was a lesson for Japanese manufacturers. Since their inception and really takeover, so much focus was on innovation for the purpose of performance. Dedicating years of time and money and resources to build a big motorcycle that isn't fast? How does that make sense? Sure, the Japanese manufacturers had motorcycles that weren't high performance at this point, but most of those were just evolutions of older models. If a Japanese company at this time was going to dedicate a ton of money and time, it was going to be something like the CBX, or later, the GSXR. Yamaha showed, though, that it could be profitable to focus tons of money and energy and time not on performance as the main thing, but all the other things that make motorcycling great. I wonder if there aren't quite a few similarities in terms of the market from the early 80s to today. We've experienced a similar boost in high-performance motorcycles over the past 10 or 15 years. Just like the 70s and 80s, as high performance and high tech motorcycles were really hitting their stride, there was a longing for different kinds of motorcycles. Some riders, not all, but some were getting bored with performance, bored with high revving inline fours that were pretty much all the same, and bored with motorcycles that were already becoming way too fast for the street. Oh, cool, your bike has 7 more horsepower and revs 300 RPM more? Cool. Just like 200 horsepower today. It's just boring. And that's why motorcycles like the Grom have taken off. People think that everybody who's riding a Grom is, a young or new rider, or somebody who's never ridden a real motorcycle. But in reality, many of the people you see on bikes like Groms have been riding for decades, and many of them came from sport bikes. The same is also true of retro bikes and retro bike riders as well. Many of them have years and years of experience and have ridden all sorts of bikes. I feel there's a similar appetite for different kinds of motorcycles today. I think more than ever, we would praise a company like Yamaha or Honda if they stepped out of the norm and made an all-new motorcycle that was just totally unlike anything in their lineup, instead of just trying to cash in on markets by dressing up already existing models, because we know that happens quite a bit as well. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Thanks for watching, guys. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Did you ever own or ride a Virago? I'm guessing many of you did. And also, do you think manufacturers like Yamaha need to branch out and make more unique motorcycles today? Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one, and ride safe.